Hello! Today's stories come from r/ProRevenge. Today we have a classic pro-revenge story that's been covered by all the big channels has just received a massive update years later. Check it out. My friend's ex-wife gets his family's business shut down and burns their lives to the ground. Not what you may think. Sorry for the somewhat misleading title, but I couldn't resist. This story isn't about me, but two people I'm friends with. We'll call one Ray and one Justin. I'm posting this with Justin's permission, and he'll probably be reading the thread. Some background. Ray and Justin grew up in an extremely restrictive, insular religious community that borders on being a cult. They both read a lot from a young age, even though reading outside of the religion's material was discouraged. And so both of them grew increasingly skeptical and dissatisfied with their environment due to having this peek into the outside world. In high school, this shared mindset brought them together, and they started secretly dating. For context, dating was absolutely strictly verboten in this religious community. You went straight from single to married with zero in between. So when Justin and Ray's parents caught them dating, they forced them to get married. To be clear, it wasn't like they were even having sex. They basically were driving around together and holding hands in the downtown square where all the kids hung out. Very tame, sheltered kid stuff. Ray and Justin started living together as husband and wife. But unfortunately for their families, putting those two together doubled their resiliency. And together, they cooked up a plan to get out. They set up a secret bank account at a bank outside the religious community's influence. Since their families had access to their accounts and everyone who worked at the main bank was also in the same community and gossiped about everyone's financial transactions. They started squirreling away money in small amounts the families wouldn't question being missing from their paychecks. When they were 20, they finally had enough money to start over and they got out. They basically left their house in the dead of night with nothing but what could fit in their car and uprooted to live across the country. Pretty quickly after they moved, they decided to get amicably divorced since they never wanted to be married anyway. They still lived together for a while and basically became something between platonic roommates and each other's only family. Over time, they started dating other people. Some partners were scared off by the weird relationship between them, but most got it and understood that Justin and Ray had basically bonded together through mutual trauma. I also met both of them during this time, and we became close friends. This whole time, both their families and other members of their community were relentlessly harassing them. People were showing up at their house at all hours, and they had reason to believe people were trying to steal their identities over the years, though they'd fortunately both put a freeze on their credit, so nothing ever came of it. Then Justin had a bad accident, a really bad accident. He was on his bike and a car blew through a stop sign without slowing down and plowed right into him. He had to be rushed to the hospital and landed in the ICU. Ray was his emergency contact, and I was with her and some other friends when she got the call. I immediately drove her to the hospital with a couple of other people, and she was melting down, understandably. The hospital staff wouldn't let us all in when we got there, but they let Ray in. She came out periodically to let us know what was going on. Justin wasn't unconscious, but he was totally out of it and didn't seem to know she was there. Probably from the painkillers. But she was convinced he had permanent, debilitating brain damage, and basically, the group of us were just soothing her and reassuring her it would be fine. A friend of ours who worked at the hospital as an MRI tech was also stopping by when she could on her breaks and calming down Ray. We'd been there all night and part of the day at this point, and the medical staff was giving us reason to be hopeful. But things got worse. To this day, no one knows how they found out, but 14 hours after Justin's accident, his parents, uncles, and grandfather showed up. They immediately had all of us removed from the ICU, Ray included. Unfortunately, as his ex-wife, she was no longer his legal next of kin and had no rights against his blood family. At this point, she was absolutely hysterical and inconsolable. She was convinced Justin's family would hurt him. I'm ashamed to say all three of us that were there with her thought she was overreacting. We all knew Ray and Justin had left a messed up situation, but it wasn't like his own family would do anything to impede his recovery. She was getting angry with us for trying to calm her down and tried to explain that according to their religion, she and Justin deserved punishment from God, and only the greatest suffering could prompt repenting and redemption. She said their families embraced this thinking and wanted them to suffer because it would prove that they did the wrong thing by leaving and suffering would drive them back to the fold. She said as long as Justin was with his family, he wouldn't be safe. Our friend who worked for the hospital came and found Rae at that point. She made Rae swear up and down she wouldn't tell anyone she told her this because she could get in deep trouble for releasing privileged information to someone unauthorized. But she'd caught wind that Justin's parents were aggressively demanding the hospital release him into their care, and they were involving lawyers. The hospital was currently refusing because Justin wasn't stable enough to leave. But our friend warned Rae that as soon as Justin got to be stable or the lawyers scared the hospital enough, it's possible the parents would be able to take Justin. This shocked the rest of us. Realizing his parents were not only willing to remove Justin from the hospital that had saved his life in the condition he was still in, but were actively trying to do it made us really get for the first time why Rae was going out of her head with fear. At this point, Rae snapped into do or die mode. Convinced that Justin was about to literally die if she didn't act, she decided she would do everything in her power to start a fire at home so that Justin's family would want to run back to put it out. And this wasn't too hard because she had a lot of dirt on the whole community she came from. Like a madwoman, she started blowing the whistle all over Justin's family. She called the IRS's fraud hotline and detailed all the ways that the family business was committing tax fraud. She submitted an ATF tip about how that same family business was illegally selling firearms without a license and without following any of the proper protocols, and was knowingly selling guns to convicted felons. She reported one of Justin's uncles for owning several guns as a convicted felon. She also reported Justin's mom's unlicensed daycare business, which was apparently extremely shady, including having over 30 children packed into one house with Justin's mom as the only adult, and many of the childcare duties being farmed out to Justin's 12 and 14-year-old sisters. She called Child Protection Services on Justin's uncles and his parents for keeping their children out of school, and for physical abuse in one uncle's case. In all of these reports, she provided extensive details. She finished her calls and emails, and then she waited. We all waited for several hours, and nothing happened. Then, miraculously, Justin became lucid enough to understand what was going on and make his own decisions, and he kicked his family out again. From there began a slow but steady path to recovery. In all the relief and excitement to see Justin on the mend, we'd almost forgotten about Rae's campaign of desperation until a couple of weeks later, when the screaming voicemail started pouring into both of them. First, the business was being investigated by the IRS. Then it was being investigated for illegal firearms dealing. Then the daycare was getting investigated. At first, Rae felt a little guilty, but then she was like, you know what? No regrets. They would have killed Justin. From what they've been able to piece together in the year and a half since this happened, the business has gone under and the daycare is shuttered. The uncle is 6 months into a new 5-year prison sentence for firearm possession. Child Protection Services investigated, which scared the heck out of the family, but nothing really came of it, which is especially sad in the case of the cousins being physically abused. That said, the parents are now too scared to keep the kids home from school, and with the unlicensed daycare shut down, the mom's not exploiting her daughter's labor anyway, so she has no incentive to keep them home. So Justin's little siblings are at least getting their education. Justin and Rae are both happy and thriving. Justin, unfortunately, will never fully recover from the accident. He has some permanent neurological damage that results in tremors, but he's pumped to be alive. He can work a full-time job, he can still be pretty physically active, and as far as I'm concerned, he wins. Edit 2. Sorry, I can't answer any questions about what the religious group or cult is, even the PM'd ones. Justin really doesn't want this post coming back to haunt him and Rae in real life, and I feel like I've already probably said more than I should have about it. Comments from first post with more information collected and compiled by u/fatherson holy toast. In response to someone sharing a similar experience growing up in a cult, I naively assumed before all this that even the worst families ultimately don't want their loved ones to be hurt or to die. And this really changed my perspective. It's hard for people who grew up in good homes to understand what a truly toxic and abusive family can be like. And I still feel a lot of guilt for not trying harder before this happened to understand what Justin and Rae had experienced earlier in their lives. In response to questions about how the family found them, I don't know, but within a month of leaving, despite the secrecy, their families had figured out where they were and were sending people from the same religious group who lived in their city to their house to berate them. I have no idea how they found them. In response to a similar question about how the family got to the hospital so quickly, I'd really like to know this too. They live all the way across the country, so taking into account that, assuming they were at home at the time, they would have had to arrange flights, take those flights, deal with airport stuff on both ends, get to the hospital, etc. They would have had to have found out almost immediately. Ray's running theory is that somehow the hospital had Justin's previous health insurance, which was connected to his parents, on file. But Justin doesn't think that could be it because he never used that old insurance in their new city. That and how quickly their families tracked them down when they first ran away gives me the creeps. It's like they have a magic Beauty and the Beast mirror. In response to yet another similar question about whether Justin or Ray ever figured out how they were being tracked. Nope, still scratching my head over that to this day. Ray and Justin are completely no contact with everyone from that life, even their little siblings, so it doesn't make any sense. I also don't know how they tracked them down when they ran away, or how they can always call no matter how many times Ray and Justin changed their phone numbers. In response to someone theorizing that Justin's family had arranged for the bicycle accident, that's a chilling thought, but no, the guy who hit them was just some random college guy who was driving drunk with a bunch of passengers. In response to someone asking the same thing, if the driver was hired by the family, no, I don't think so. The guy who hit him was just a random drunk college student, and he ended up being financially on the hook for Justin's medical bills, had his license taken away for driving drunk, etc. If someone had put him up to it, he would have flipped on them pretty early to get out of being liable for everything. I'm thinking, hitting Justin basically ruined this guy's life. In response to a follow up question about whether they caught the driver, yeah, he was the one who called the ambulance. He didn't try to flee or anything. In response to more questions on the payout from the accident, yeah, there was some kind of settlement, but I don't know the details. In response to a similar question, yes, he had to pay for Justin's medical bills, and then there was some kind of payout beyond that. I'm not privy to the details, but Justin didn't have to work for a few months while he focused on physical therapy. The guy who hit him was pretty young, and from what Justin's told me, it sounds like he was traumatized by the accident as well. Justin seems to feel sorry for the guy, but as far as I'm concerned, he was driving drunk, so screw him. In response to a Justin and Rae shipper hoping they'll get back together, nah, not a chance at this point, sorry. They're basically surrogate siblings. And to another, no, they aren't romantically interested in each other at all. Rae has actually come out as bi since leaving the cult and is now in a pretty serious relationship with a woman going on about a year now. Justin is still kind of dating around casually to make up for lost time, so to speak. In response to someone saying Justin and Rae should have stayed married, but platonically, to be each other's legal next of kin, you make a fair point. I think it was important to both of them to dissolve the marriage as part of their escape, because they'd been forced into it and it became a kind of prison. Also, it probably would have made dating a lot harder if they were still married. I suspect Rae and her girlfriend may get married in a year or two, so she'll be all set. In response to someone wanting original OP or their friends to report the bank that shares client details, oh, trust me, the bank stuff is small potatoes when it comes to things about this community that Justin or Rae could blow up if they wanted to. It's a very weird, very problematic group that genuinely believes it's beholden only to its own laws. And you can imagine the kinds of things that go on as a result. Neither of them wants to be involved with the group in any capacity going forward, or actively draw the group's attention back to them, though even for more whistleblowing. This was more or less a one-off out of, at the time, necessity. Wow. Cults are always so interesting to learn about, and I always think of them in the past tense, like there aren't many still operating today around the world. This story is a great reminder that they still exist and still hold a lot of influence. If you've heard it before, we won't cover any more comments since I think the reposter did a fantastic job summarizing them. So let's get on to the update. An update on Justin and Rae 3 years later. I posted a few years ago in r/ProRevenge about the experiences of two of my best friends who left the cult they grew up in. I occasionally get private messages on this account from people wanting to know how Justin and Rae are doing. I doubt many people will see this since I'm just posting on my Reddit profile instead of a subreddit, but I wanted to share this for the benefit of anyone still checking in on the original post. Justin gave me the go ahead to post an update since a lot has happened since then. Sorry in advance for how long this ended up being. So, to recap, in early September 2017, Justin got in a bad bike accident and his family came out of nowhere, despite Justin and Rae being no contact with them, and tried to have him removed from the hospital where he was receiving care. Rae freaked out and blew the whistle on a bunch of illegal stuff that was happening in both their families of origin. Not a whole lot came of it, to be honest, once the heat blew over. The biggest effect was that Justin's uncle went to prison for the family business illegally selling handguns, but he's been out now for a while on parole. It sounds like Justin's mom is back to her old shenanigans running an unlicensed daycare out of her home. For context, the religious group Justin and Rae came from basically run/own their own town, and these things are all extremely common there. No one properly documents firearm sales because Second Amendment. Many members of this religious group are felons and still own guns. Again, I guess because Second Amendment. Businesses are frequently run outside of proper licensure and regulations, with rampant tax avoidance and tax fraud because they answer only to the laws of God. And children are often exploited for their labor and generally neglected and not treated well. Probably in part because it's common for couples to marry very young and then have 5+ children. Justin is one of 3 children, which is considered an unusually small family. So since I last posted in March of 2019, of course a lot has happened in the meantime. Rae and her girlfriend got engaged at the end of 2019 and were planning their wedding for early fall 2020. When the virus happened, they ended up doing a small outdoor elopement that summer instead, with about 10 witnesses, including me and a few others from our core friend group, who Justin and Rae refer to as their chosen family. Justin got ordained online through the Universal Life Church and performed the ceremony. It was an awesome day. Rae's family upped their harassment considerably between her engagement and the wedding. Members of their religious order who live in our city were showing up at her house to try to talk to her. When she wouldn't answer the door, they would leave creepy notes taped to her door with short messages like, "Repent." After the wedding, though, the contact dropped off considerably, which she was very happy about. Justin is doing well. He's been in a serious relationship for the last 2 years with a woman we all love, who has meshed into our little chosen family really well. He's also made amazing progress on his neurological issues from the accident. The doctors say the effects will never go away, but he's adapted really well. He's working full time with no problem and is cycling every day again. He's still getting a lot of harassment, unfortunately, but it never escalates to anything scarier than a lot of phone calls, which he blocks as new numbers pop up, and the occasional doorbell, which he never answers. Justin and Rae still don't know how their families of origin are tracking them. They've been living in our city for over a decade now, and they've each moved residences several times during that time frame and changed their numbers a few times. Each time, the family seems to know that new information almost immediately. They continue calling them and leaving voicemails at the new numbers. Members of their religious group are showing up at the new house almost immediately, etc. Justin was subletting for a couple of years in a gated condo complex, which was awesome while it lasted, since his family's emissaries couldn't get in. After my last post, I bullied them into getting a forensic sweep of all their devices and digital accounts, but it turned up nothing. No spyware on their devices, no logins to any of their accounts coming from their birth state, etc. Their social media is heavily locked down, privacy-wise, and even then, they're both very careful about what they post. I've Googled both their names, and I'm not finding anything on those private database sites involving their info, so that part remains a mystery. I still welcome ideas on how their families are tracking them. The biggest update, though, is that Justin and Rae have become an informal lifeline out of their creepy hometown, which has been really cool to see. The oldest of Justin's little sisters was the first one. She turned 18 early last year and reached out to Justin on Instagram. She had been accepted to college and her parents forbade her from going and had upped their strictness, including grounding her because they were so pissed she applied at all. Justin sent her a plane ticket and she followed in his footsteps, packed up her essential belongings when her parents were both out of the house, and got out of Dodge. She stayed with him in our city and then in the fall moved to college and is living in the dorms there. Justin has assured her that she always has a home with him on her school breaks, and that if there's another school closure that closes her dorms and pushes her classes to being online only, she can come stay with him again and do her classes online from his house. The next Lifeline recipient was a 19-year-old boy Justin and Rae didn't really know who had been a friend of Justin's sister from school. He stayed in touch with her after she got out, and Justin ended up buying a plane ticket for him too. He actually came and stayed with me since I had a spare room and Justin's sister was still at his place at the time, and he was a really cool little dude. And yes, I started getting people showing up at my door after he moved in. Wild times. I helped him get a job, and after a few months, he moved into a house share with roommates his own age. We all still see him around a lot, and he seems to be doing really well. Let me tell you, the kid is overjoyed with the casual dating model in the secular world and has been putting a lot of mileage on the apps. He doesn't think he wants to go to college, but I've been encouraging him to look at trade programs and apprenticeships. We'll see. The most recent recipient of the Justin and Rae Instagram DM Foundation for Cult Escapism is Ray's 25-year-old cousin. She was stuck in an abusive marriage, and the religious group slash her family was basically telling her to suck it up and deal with it, and to be a submissive slash godly wife, and try harder to get pregnant to make her husband happy. She got in touch with Ray because she had no one else to turn to, and Ray helped her get out and come to our city. That's been a bit of a weird situation because, unlike the other two, the cousin is still more or less a true believer. She only left because she was convinced her husband would kill her, and she's been kind of mean about Ray's wife, even though Ray is literally the only one helping her. But Ray has been an absolute angel to her despite that and keeps telling us that deprogramming takes time when we complain about her. It's unclear yet how the family feels about Justin and Rae helping the three escapees or whether they're blaming them as corrupting influences. Weirdly, the cousin and the friend have both been getting the same harassment that Justin and Rae have consistently gotten over the years. But Justin's sister hasn't heard a single peep, either here or in our city or away at college. Beats me as to why or what the difference is. Anyway, I hope that satisfies the interest of anyone who still thinks about this post or who has messaged me. I'll end this post with a plug for the Safe Passage Foundation, which is a nonprofit that gets vulnerable people out of cults. If this is an issue you care about, I encourage you to support them however you can. Wow, I never would have expected that they'd still be getting hounded this many years later. It's amazing that the group's members are still able to find them. But never fear, the Reddit detectives are on the case. Police 420 said, "How on earth are they tracking these poor people down?" Frozen Bear Mo replied, "It's pretty easy and unfortunately legal. You can buy an updated address from data brokers who sell personal information. If you're hiding from a cult, get a post office box a town over." Police 420 replied, "That explains the address, but not the hospital. Also, is that address immediately available like the OP seems to infer?" Frozen Bear Mo wraps it up, "I don't work for a data collection broker, so I don't know all the inner workings. I can tell you from personal experience, though, it's instant. As an example, I have never done business with SiriusXM. I get several flyers in the mail addressed to me per week. The moment I put in a change of address with the post office, I had new SiriusXM flyers. They even beat my moving van. Data brokers are scary." Heal My Soul Please said, "Yeah, I have found that the best criticism of extremists comes from their own pens. I remember being asked to find people using this list a few times and feeling so conflicted. I ended up not trying to find them and lying about it, which just increases the dissonance even more. To paraphrase War Games, the only way to beat the cult is not to play their game." It's a Terrible Life said, "Sounds like there's a town full of people that need to have a traumatic accident with a ball peen hammer." OP replied, "I don't know. It's tough to draw the line between perpetrator and victim in these kinds of situations involving brainwashing, especially if it's multi generational, and everyone in this town was raised in the cult from birth. I'm glad there's starting to be a path out for those who want it, though." If you've enjoyed the story and would like to hear more, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Thanks, and bye for now.